All right, thank you all so much for joining today's event, Minorities and Myths, Increasing Diversity in COVID-19 Vaccine Trials. We have some logistics to start. This event is being recorded. Many of you sent in great questions for our speakers, but if anyone has additional questions during the event, you can send a direct message to a moderator in the chat and we'll try to get to as many as we can. As so many of us know, minority communities have been disproportionately affected by COVID-19. Longstanding systemic health and social inequities have put many people from racial and ethnic minority groups at a disadvantage when it comes to healthcare. We'll start with two 15-minute presentations with some great speakers here, and then we'll conclude with a discussion on how we can include minorities in anticipation of a COVID-19 vaccine. My name is Cameo Hazelwood, and I will be your moderator today. I graduated from the University of Pennsylvania in May 2019 and completed my master's in behavior and decision sciences from the University of Pennsylvania in May 2020. I am currently pursuing a career in medicine by completing a pre-medical post-baccalaureate program at Thomas Jefferson University. This event is sponsored as well by the Student National Medical Association, which is an organization that is committed to supporting current and future underrepresented minority medical students through programming, outreach, and events. So let's go ahead and get started. Our first speaker today is Dr. David Weiner. Dr. Weiner is a professor emeritus at the University of Pennsylvania Perelman School of Medicine. Dr. Weiner directs a translational molecular immunology research team focused on developing gene-based vaccines, immune therapies, and molecular interventions for the treatment of human and animal diseases, as well as current work on the novel coronavirus 19 vaccine. Our second speaker is Dr. Dan Romer. Dr. Romer is a research director at the University of Pennsylvania Annenberg School for Communication and Public Policy. His research focuses on media and social influences on health, with particular attention to the social transmission of risky behavior in youth. His recently published work examines conspiracy theories as societal barriers to controlling the spread of COVID-19 in the United States, which is his topic of discussion today. Thank you both so much for joining us. And with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you, Dr. Weiner, to start.
Okay, let's see if I can get this on the full screen. Thank you so much, Cameo, and thank you for this kind invitation to the meeting organizers. I'm going to start with want to point out that I do work with lots of companies, as highlighted on the screen. I have different services and everything, and work with different companies that are involved with the vaccines and immune therapy. So, and these are monitored by the WISTAR General Counsel Office, where I'm Executive Vice President. So you should not believe anything I'm telling you. And I guess this is an incredibly important time for talking about this pandemic and its impact, because infectious disease doesn't really care about anything but its own successes. And so it tends to reveal our weaknesses as a group in society. So this is really and it is, of course, doing that. So I do want to point out there was a pandemic similarly 100 years ago, quite extraordinary when you look at pictures. And I thought, being a medical society, you probably are familiar with this, but I was able to find sort of things that show how life was during that time. This is in the middle of pharmacists, and they were showing they were mask wearers as opposed to people who weren't mask wearers. So it was safe to go to their pharmacy. Churches, schools, and shows were closed. You can also see this was during World War I, so Americans and French smash foe is in there. You notice disposal of bodies were so large, they presented problems. Guidelines, wear a mask, save your life. And these were the military influenza ward, showing the risk mitigation of putting screens around beds And basically a third of the world's population was ultimately infected with 50 million deaths. And I do want to point out this pandemic had 3 waves as shown on the far right. And we seem to be in the second of ours.
Dr. White,
So,
I'm sorry, I don't
yes,
think you can see your screen. You might need to click the next slide here.
can you see it now?
Well, we can see your screen, but not the slide that you're on.
Okay, I'm not sure what to do. Let's see. Let's get out of this. Sorry about that. So what do you see now? I see writing on the slide.
Yeah, writing as well as the next slide.
Writing has gone. So you can see this slide, right?
Yes,
All right, so maybe we'll just won't use full screen if that works. I don't know what you can see.
that works. We can see the screen now.
Okay, so let's just, I'll go through this. Okay, so you can see the screen. That's the pharmacist, wear a mask, churches, schools closed, 3 waves, bodies, and the military influenza ward. So, but, and that was the way the world was. I still don't know why these marks are, but we then had, you know, in the, I took out that slide. Well, we had in the early 1900s intensification of vaccines, and it was really one vaccine, smallpox. And this is the effect of vaccines. Cases are in colors. So you see when you start vaccinating, they go away. Pertussis, whooping cough, mumps, the colors all go away. And of course, we have outbreaks now when we don't get vaccinated. So we need vaccines to live. We cannot live the way we live now in close quarters like this without having enormous numbers of hospitalizations. We would probably have 5 million more hospitalizations per year without our current vaccines, which would be extraordinary. And then this has had a dramatic effect on human longevity, vaccines and antibiotics, and then modern medicine up here at the top, increasing average lifespan from about 42 to 44 in 1900 to close to 80 on average. And that has created, that's an enormous success, and also creates populations that are at risk, which comes back to this outbreak. I do want to share with this slide, and just stop me if you can't see them. This is last 40 years of outbreaks. So we're in an unusual new situation with changing climate, encroachment, deforestation, the rest. We have many more interactions and jumps of infectious disease that sometimes go away and sometimes don't. HIV from chimpanzees, for example, hepatitis C, which is established in the population, chikungunya, Rift Valley, H7N9, enterovirus, the new enteroviruses, and of course, coronaviruses. We've had 3 coronavirus outbreaks in this century. The last 20 years, we've had SARS, MERS, and now SARS-CoV-2. And so this is the new state, and we are on heightened alert is the way to think about it. Now, this slide sort of shows where we have been all up to this time as far as our countermeasures. What you're looking at here is a curve from a paper by Bloom and PNAS with Rino Rapoli, and it shows that basically we have some type of report of an outbreak. The media starts reporting on it. Scientists start to get interested. Money goes in, usually to academic labs, biotechs, and industry. And then public health measures and other events kick in, and we start to get control, and society loses interest. No one develops a vaccine or a countermeasure, and then we have an outbreak again. And that was exactly what was happening with Ebola. That's a perfect example. Just we had a vaccine that we could develop for almost 20 some odd years, but it just kept falling off the map until really we got very motivated more recently. And one of the things that changed in the world is this. It's a slide about an organization called Sepi, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, that was started after a discussion and arguments led by Adel Mahmoud, who was at one time president of Merck Vaccines, chairman of medicine at Case Western, a professor and lecturer at UPenn in our vaccine course, and Stanley Plotkin, a professor at University of Pennsylvania and CHOP, and Jeremy Farrar, who wrote this article saying we need to stop this, we need a way to risk mitigate with rapid deployment. And Gates Foundation and the Wellcome Trust took up the charge, funded a new organization called Sepi to start to develop vaccines all the way through to efficacy for outbreak diseases. And our story in entering SARS, really, COVID-2 has to do with that. We were funded by Sepi right after they funded to work on MERS. We had been working on outbreak vaccines for Ebola. Pablo Tebas at UPenn published this paper on JID, and this we did a Zika vaccine. The first Zika vaccine was developed. It's actually at Penn, led again by Pablo Tebas, New England Journal paper. And our MERS paper was in Lancet Infectious Disease just a year ago, the MERS vaccine. And this just shows in that vaccine, Lancet Infectious Disease, we developed antibodies. They were similar to antibodies that convalescent patients would develop, and T cells that in patients that were even better, led by Captain Moraditejad at Walter Reed. So then Sepi was following companies and working with them for 3 years before COVID broke, and they were testing different technologies. And COVID broke, and this is kind of a global snapshot of where we are. We have about 39 million cases, 8 million in the US. The US leads now the globe at this point in time, 1.1 million deaths globally, 218,000 in the US. These are disproportionate based on race. We should note, US has about 300,000 plus or minus cases per week now. And the financial impact is staggering. 9 children globally already, and that's probably low because we're almost a few weeks since these numbers I took these numbers, and we lose about 375 billion per month. So this is going to have enormous economic impact that will stay with us for a while. And this paper really reported that until we have a vaccine, and I would add, or a countermeasure, they didn't really. Daniel Layden and his team and Neil Ferguson didn't really evaluate countermeasures. We're going to be stuck the way we are now for a while. And so with the funding that was put out, there was really advancement of multiple vaccine platforms. And so vaccines, really the idea is you're going to stick something into a person, they're going to respond against the part of the pathogen that you put into your vaccine, develop antibodies and T cells, antibodies to bind and inactivate the pathogen, T cells to destroy virus hiding in cells, and you will either recover faster or never even show signs of infection. And so there are different platforms. There are viral vectors. They're sort of one of our historic best, where we chop out pieces of them. And some of the ones getting the biggest attention in this outbreak are adenovirus family, which is originally a gene therapy vector. You cut out the genetic guts of it, you put, to weaken it, make it really not a disease-causing virus at all. You then put in your SARS-CoV antigens, and now this becomes a machine for delivery of those genetically encoded antigens into the cell to create the vaccine. The others that's really getting a lot of attention are the recombinant protein, designed structurally or not, plus adjuvants, and these are Novavax would be an example of that. And then the ones you probably heard a lot about are the RNA, nucleic acid approaches, RNA and DNA, and our lab is involved in this sector. And so I'll just give one additional slide on them. So nucleic acids are a new approach to vaccine development. They're really delivering genetic software which encodes a piece of the virus. That piece is then made within our cells, and by made within our cells, it makes the immune system very angry and produces and responds to that foreign antigen being in our cells, which it shouldn't be, and drives antibody responses. In the case of both can drive CD4 T cell response, but DNA seems to be better at CD8 T cells. And the advantage for them, and what you're seeing, particularly the RNA move ahead very fast, was this is made enzymatically, which allows you to make it very quickly. And it's sort of these two are more plug and play characteristics for delivering your vaccine, getting it expressed within cells, and creating immune responses. RNA are a combination of the RNA itself and a lipid nanoparticle for delivery, and DNA is a DNA sequence itself delivered with a skin delivery device to directly implant it locally in the regions of the skin. So because Sepi had been doing their background, they were watching and monitoring the outbreak situation in Asia. And by January, they had decided to start funding groups. And the first 3 groups they picked were GSK and University of Queensland for a protein adjuvant approach, Inovio with Wistar, and then partnering with UPenn for clinical development for DNA and delivery, and Moderna and NIH, and and then they added 6 additional programs up to 9. And the Moderna, of course, was the fastest to move to the clinic in 8 weeks, and ours moved in about 3.5 months, and the papers are published here. And this was announced at Davos in January. So I'm going to really just highlight, we did our team working under the Inovio Sepi program, did an enormous amount of preclinical work, showed we could get antibodies, T cells, that the antibodies would neutralize. They would neutralize the divergent new strain, 614G of SARS-CoV-2, and that in monkeys and in mice, we could protect from viral load and infection in mice, and many, many other studies. And these were moved into the clinic. The trial opened at UPenn. There's Pablo Tebas, who leads those trials. And the phase 1 opened at Penn, and then brought in other sites, and then eventually was expanded to additional participants of different age groups. Then it was further expanded, and trial sites opened in Korea for phase 1, phase 2, and now in Asia as well. And Inovio has filed for expanding into phase 2, phase 3 large studies, and they're working with the FDA to get regulatory concurrence, which would allow that to happen. So now I take you to something that's really the next major difference in this outbreak. That is the way the world has funded them. Number one, let's start with the United States. Warpspeed, Operation Warpspeed, basically takes the risk out of vaccine companies by funding them up front. And by providing hundreds of millions to up to $1 billion, that allows them to just develop them without worrying about that cost. And so that's how come these have happened so fast. And Warpspeed goal is to produce 300 million vaccine doses by the end of 2021. There's some question about whether that will really be able to happen now. And 6 of the 8 announced partnerships have been announced, and they're Moderna, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Janssen. These 2 are RNA. These 2 are the adeno type vectors, different strains. And Novavax and Sanofi GSK are both recombinant subunit. And there's other platforms that will be announced as the Warpspeed decides. And then you have a second group, and this is kovacs. And I think you probably saw in the news that the United States is right now not participating in this. kovacs is an alliance between Sepi, Gavi, the World Health, and also with Gates funding to deliver 2 billion doses by the end of 2021. It's going to build the largest portfolio of vaccine candidates globally, and they're going to deliver them for maximum benefit. And their goal is to end the acute phase of the pandemic globally by the end of 2021, and to guarantee fair and equitable access to COVID-19 for all participants. And they've been writing about this. And they've chosen 9 projects that they've announced, and these are them up there: Inovio, Moderna, CureVac, Merck, AZ, Hong Kong, Novavax, Clover, and University of Queensland, GSK. And to give you an overview sort of where all these different things are, they keep moving. And there's DNAs, RNAs, viral vectors, and proteins. There's really up to 300 vaccines, depending on how you count it. This is from a New York Times article just recently. And there's about 5 that the government's already sort of distributing them, and somewhere between 5 and 11 in large-scale trials, depending on how you count. And I told you about the ones that move through Warpspeed and others. So we've started to learn a lot, though, about our vaccines. We learn about vaccines from previous exposure, and the first is that convalescent antibodies in patients who recover, especially with mild disease, it seems like most people do not get reinfected, and they might even have very low antibodies, but there does seem to be benefit. So we believe antibodies are definitely important, and neutralizing antibodies. But this paper by Patel et al. And JAMA shows that antibodies in people who recover don't last that long, and we have seen a few cases of reinfections, but they apparently to date have been mostly mild. And so vaccines that produce antibodies are important. And then we've also seen more and more of these kind of papers recently that people who have mild disease have T cells pre-existing, either cross-reactive with other coronaviruses or from other sources. And here's a paper that from Og et al. Just came out on studying disease, mild disease associated with higher T cells than severe disease. And so vaccines that induce antibodies and T cells likely are a good focus. So I want to point out that this disease does not affect people equally. Medical conditions, people with pre-existing medical conditions are higher risk. And there have been quite a number of papers, as probably this audience knows better than me, disparate across racial lines, as shown in this paper. And so these are the conditions that are associated with higher risk: cancer, chronic kidney disease, COPD, and obesity, heart disease, sickle cell disease, type 2, diabetes. And there have been discussions now that these are important considerations for vaccine development based on racial disparities. I do want to point out that those racial disparities are actually highlighted that many of these conditions disproportionately affect minority populations. And so we could think of important populations to receive vaccines first should be several. High-risk medical conditions should be number 1. And actually that could partially address that topic I sort of am not qualified to talk about. And then the second would be essential workers. And essential workers would also include, at all different levels, similar overlapping groups percentage-wise. And then you have, of course, all the healthcare personnel. You have adults, 65 and older, that's 53 million. And there are all overlapping populations. And ultimately, this includes almost half of the adult population. And there should be more evaluations ongoing and discussion and help in breaking down these barriers that people might have or preconceived notions, because many of those groups are the highest risk. So I'm going to end with this. These are an unprecedented scope of vaccine trials. There's 280,000 participants now that are being considered to be in these trials, 470 different trial sites. This is extraordinary, 34 countries. And Operation Warpspeed and Sepi have changed vaccine development permanently and likely changed biologics and the vaccine and drug industry forever. And there's several vaccine candidates that have shown preclinical impact in animal models and a combination of immune response report in the clinic. There's no evidence for ADE, but there are some programs that have been flagged temporarily, at least, for some issues related to rare safety concerns. So it supports continued vaccine advancement, but detailed attention to that advancement. And it does require significant discussion of who receives these vaccines fastest to do the most population benefit. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to thank all the people. It's an enormous team. We're proud to be part of this Inovio Sepi team together with all my colleagues and all these supporters. So thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Weiner. We have a lot of questions coming in, but we'll get to those a little bit later. Dr. Romer, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you next.
Okay. Yeah, I got to wait, I guess, until Dr. Weiner gets off.
Am I? Oh, I see. I'll stop. There you go. Sorry about that.
No problem. Let me see if I can bring it up. Is everybody seeing this now?
Yes, we can.
Oh, good. Okay, I'm not going to bother with trying to make it a full screen thing. Too complicated. So yeah, I'm going to talk about vaccine hesitancy, that research we've done on that in the US, and beliefs that people have that involve conspiracies about the pandemic and how those are getting in the way of people's acceptance of an eventual vaccine, and in particular, Black and Hispanic Americans. So what I'm going to talk about briefly is what role do conspiracy beliefs play in the current pandemic? Why might Black and Hispanic Americans be particularly affected by these beliefs? And what can be done to overcome them in regard to accepting an eventual vaccine, which we're all, as we see with Dr. Weiner's presentation, we're going to be presented with very soon, probably more than one. So what are conspiracy beliefs? They're beliefs about the causes of major events that ascribe them to unseen actors with malevolent intentions. So the pandemic is clearly a major event. It's not well understood. We don't know quite how it managed to get all over the world in no time flat. We don't know even what animal we got it from and how it jumped from animals to people. We don't know how it'll be treated and eventually overcome. Lots of questions about. So this allows people to start coming up with explanations. And so conspiracy beliefs are very common right now. And so the evidence for these beliefs is basically, it's basically suspicion rather than any credible sources or information, and which of course is a problem because we don't have a lot of information. And even at this point, I mean, back in March when we first learned that this was a pandemic, at that point we had very little, and now we have more, but still, we don't fully understand the full impact of what this pandemic is doing. So as a result, conspiracy beliefs are very difficult to either prove or disprove. And that's what makes them very tricky. They are, on one hand, plausible to a certain extent. On the other hand, very difficult to say whether it's true or false. And researchers have found over time now, they've been studying these kinds of beliefs in lots of different contexts. And when you do surveys and you say to people, how much do you think these following statements are true? These are the kind of statements that people who are likely to latch on to conspiracies are likely also to endorse. And when you look at them, you get a sense that people who believe these things are people who are feeling powerless in our political world. They see that our lives are controlled by unseen actors in secret places. We live in a democracy, but there are a few people running things, not an implausible thing to think. The people who run the country are really not known to us. And in the past, they've used the recession and elections, are controlled by small groups of people. So people who believe these kinds of things are more likely to latch on to conspiracies. But they vary a bit. It'll depend on what the events are that we're trying to explain, and then therefore there'll be some variation in the kinds of conspiracies that people will endorse. So we did a survey back in March of a large sample of Americans. It's a probability sample. It was done online, and I think that's how Cameo got to me, because we published that. And we also resurveyed that same group of people, about 840 people, again in July. So we were able to see how these beliefs changed over time. I'm going to mainly show you results from March. So there are some beliefs that aren't quite conspiracies. So here's one we asked people, are the mainstream news media exaggerating the seriousness of this disease? And you can see, for example, that the Hispanic respondents are more likely to believe this. But a lot of people believe this. I mean, this is not necessarily a conspiracy belief. And you also see, for example, our Black respondents are not more likely than the average American to endorse something like that. And so this is one of those beliefs that you wouldn't quite call a conspiracy. But let's look at one that is a conspiracy and that we see both Hispanic and Black Americans endorsing. So, and this one has clear medical implications. The pharmaceutical industry created the coronavirus to increase sales of its drugs and vaccines. So here's the response distribution for those who identify as Hispanic versus the rest of the sample. And you can see that there's definitely an uptick for those who say probably or definitely true. And the same is true for our Black respondents. And if you look at the definitely false, there's a huge disparity there. And of course, a much stronger endorsement of these beliefs among the Black respondents. And the note on the bottom says these are weighted to be representative of the US population. Here's another one. The virus was created by the Chinese government. Here you see among Hispanic respondents, probably true, much more endorsed at that level, not so much definitely. And the same for Black respondents. So these suspicions and conspiracy beliefs go beyond the pure medical, like the pharma industry being responsible, to beliefs about other malevolent actors. And this tends to be the case with conspiracy beliefs. They kind of transcend any logical boundaries. They sort of go across different content. But I think the one about pharma is particularly important for Black and Hispanic Americans because they have to depend on big pharma to produce and deliver these vaccines. You can also see the beginnings of some concerns about the government and its spokespersons talking about vaccines and other means of combating the virus. So we asked people, how much trust do you have in Dr. Fauci? This was again in March. So some people said they were not familiar with him, as you can see here. So these are our Hispanic respondents, and they don't necessarily have as much trust in him as the rest of the US. They have some trust, but they're a little guarded. And same is true for Black respondents. They're also a little more likely not to have heard of him in March, but they're not going to go out on a limb and say they have a great deal of trust. Now, and this is the head of the National Institutes of Health on the institute that's responsible for developing vaccines and presumably for making decisions at the science level about what should work. So this is concerning, so in other words, the very people who are most at risk, we could say, I wouldn't say most necessarily, but clearly at higher risk than the average American, are disadvantaged, lower income people, disproportionately occurring within Black and Hispanic populations. So if you look at if you divide up the belief in these conspiracies, and we created an index of how much do people believe in pandemic conspiracies, and at the high end of the scale up here, these are people who believe all of the ones we gave them at a high level, and then at this end you got people who don't tend to believe them. Okay, so this is a complex chart. Let me go through it. Then we ask people, how likely are you to get vaccinated if and when a vaccine becomes available? And so a 4 is, yeah, I'm going to do that for sure. And a 1 is, no, I'm not so sure and probably not. So the people who believe in these conspiracies, you can clearly see a profile of unwillingness to accept this vaccine when it becomes available, as opposed to the other end of the scale, the people who don't believe in these at all are much more likely to accept. And then in the middle, you get sort of a mixture of responses. So clearly, these conspiracy beliefs are going to transfer over to willingness to take a vaccine. And so when you look at both Black and Hispanic respondents in our survey, and we asked them, how likely are you to accept a vaccine? And this is that same scale going from 1 to 4. So 4 is very likely, 1 is not at all likely. You see that Black respondents are less likely than others to say they're going to do it for sure. And given their greater vulnerability to the infection for various reasons, this is not a good thing, because they should be higher. If the risk is greater for them, they should be more willing to accept something that can potentially protect them. Same is true for Hispanic respondents in our survey. And this held up over time. I'm showing you March, but it's also true in July. So what can be done about this? Well, I can just, I'm not a physician or a medical researcher, but recently some have suggested that the government should target groups at highest risk of the disease for access to any vaccines, including disadvantaged ethnic racial groups. So this is a suggestion that was recently published in JAMA that says the government should actively pursue people who are at higher risk so that they have access to vaccines, and that this might be a way to overcome the disproportionate disadvantage that some groups are experiencing during the pandemic. But what I think our results are showing is that if these groups harbor doubts about the safety or purpose of those vaccines, this will not work as well as it could, because you can make it available, but you need people to actually take the vaccine. So we will need trusted sources within the Black and Hispanic communities to vouch for the safety and efficacy of any vaccines in order to reduce the hesitancy to accept them. I think this is almost goes without saying. And I know the National Medical Association has already started thinking about vetting various vaccines and trying to communicate whether or not they think they're safe, and presumably telling people that they are, and if they think they are. So thanks, and get in touch with me if you want a copy of our paper, and of course, any questions you might have. And this research, I should say, I didn't put it up here, is totally funded by the Annenberg Public Policy Center. Kathleen Hall Jameson is the director, and she's the co-author on all of this work. So thanks go to her and the Policy Center for supporting this work.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Romer.
Yeah.
What great information so far. We've covered a significant range of concerns right now, from development of a vaccine to societal utility. Let's go ahead and open it up to questions now. We've gotten some great ones to figure out where we might go from here. So the reality of the situation is that there's significant concern about the vaccine development process. So let's talk about vaccine safety, efficacy, and acceptance. I'll start with you, Dr. Romer. Do you see a connection between the process of the development of a vaccine that might lead to any of your stated barriers surrounding the spread of COVID-19?
Well, I think there's been a lot of talk already about, in order to get a safe and effective vaccine, you have to try, I'm sure Dr. Weiner would endorse this idea, you have to actually test the vaccine on people in various groups to make sure they're safe for everybody. And right now we have a problem in that Black and Hispanic folks are not necessarily signing up for these vaccine trials. So as this becomes known, I think that's a barrier, because why should you trust a vaccine if people like you haven't been tested on it? And so I think this is also a major challenge. I know in Philadelphia, There are some trials going on, and they're having problems recruiting Black and Hispanic test subjects for those vaccines. And I think this is happening across the country. So I think hearing about that would make anyone wonder. I mean, I'm in a high risk group, as I'm sure Dr. Weiner is as well. I mean, we're both up there. We're not spring chickens anymore. And we're at higher risk. So I would want to know, are people like me being tested for these vaccines before I go out and get one? So I think that's a major issue.
Sure. With these types of built-in biases, right, we can look at systemically, historically, and politically. How can we learn from current events to prevent this misinformation from occurring again in the future?
So that's a very good question, because the research that's been done on conspiracy beliefs tends to suggest that they're hard to disabuse people of. Now, in our second, we've done another analysis of our data, and we find that there's some positive signs. So one of the positive signs is that social media, which have allowed a lot of these conspiracy beliefs to run rampant, are no longer seem to be promoting them at the high level they were back in March. So they're no longer associated with increases in beliefs of these kinds. What are still associated with belief in them is the conservative media, so Fox News, Rush Limbaugh, that kind of stuff. And a lot of the president's supporters fall into that category. And people who watch mainstream TV. So if you watch NBC, ABC, CBS News, you're more likely to want to get vaccinated, and you're not necessarily more likely to believe these conspiracies. So there is some evidence that news sources that give you good information, like also Washington Post, New York Times, sources like that are associated with less belief in these conspiracies over time. And also it was reassuring to see that the Black and Hispanic respondents in our surveys did not increase in their belief of these things. So it's not like it's getting worse for them. It's just it started out bad. And so I think there's some silver linings in here that suggest that news media can have an effect, and that there are some news media that are a real problem, basically on the conservative side, who tend to support the president, who said, not a big deal, even I got it, it's not a big deal. Things like people like that who are saying, don't worry about it, and are also encouraging conspiracy beliefs.
Mm-hmm. An audience member asked as well if there's anything we can do now as students to help reduce the circulation of misinformation and emphasize science.
Sure. I mean, I don't know if Dr. Weiner wants to. I mean, I feel like I'm hogging the whole story here, but
bringing both in.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually, I think that's a really important question. What can you guys do? So I think Dr. Romer's talk really focused on a lot of the misinformation that's getting out there, and I guess I have so much rolling around in my brain in answer to some of these questions. I'll just sort of throw them out there. So number one, I think a lot of this discussion, let's talk about safety first. So one of the major ways we get vaccine safety is by having large trials, and those trials normally take place over decades, right? Because a company's got to put up about $1 billion, and so if they have to put up $1 billion, they're going to follow every one of the 3 phases: phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Very, very closely to decide of their investment, because they're comparing that portfolio against everything else that's in their portfolio they might make money from. And most vaccine leadership really views themselves as 5-year cycles, and I just said it takes decades. So that product is constantly being reevaluated. And what you get up to is numbers, right? So numbers of people getting vaccinated in a trial give you back large numbers, percent of information about who's at risk and who's not. And that then you have post-licensure monitoring, which is extraordinary. It's a passive system. It's kind of like a Google system that reports in Iowa when people start having headaches all around the same and in the middle of the night that they must have some infection. we monitor it by a system called VAER. So lots of safety monitoring. In this case, the trials are large. I put up that number to let everyone know that's 280,000 participants. So we will have enormous numbers. That's just a fact. We will eventually have enormous numbers. So if you believe numbers tell you risks, and they do, we will get that. The other thing is the United States media has really focused, as Dan said, on the United States. But I brought up Sepi to point out there are trials going on in South America. Well, that addresses for some groups like Latinos and things like that at risk. They're also, Sepi is also planning, and I believe has started trials in many parts of the developing world. Asia, we're in Asia. That's another group, risk group that's slightly higher, right? And then you have, of course, African trials being planned. So that includes people of genetic relationship to the U.S. African American population. So what I'm saying is there's a lot of information across the globe, but we're not really talking about that the way it goes. And Sepi's plan is 2 billion doses. United States is 300 million. And I think that's another thing. We're not as globally discussing as we might have been before. And then the final thing I would say about this is, I think the media has really focused, and we all focus about, what the government says and all that. But I think we should also think about, do we trust our personal physicians? Do we trust our personal, the person who's taking care of our mom or our dad? If my mom has diabetes, so do I trust her doctor? And that's a high risk condition that actually is higher in the African American community than in the Caucasian community. So does that person, so if that person then says to that family, well, they should take a vaccine, they're not going to say that now though, because we don't have a vaccine. It's a straw man. And so what you guys can do is, you guys are the future of medicine. You have to collect all this information. You have to be the voice that we need of sensibility, responsibility, and call out things that are wrong. I mentioned there were some pauses already for some vaccines and now an immune therapy from Lilly that's on hold. And that shows you the FDA is doing their job, at least in this case. We might argue about some other cases. I appreciate that, but we don't have time. We only have an hour. So I guess I would say that we need you to evaluate. And we also should let you know, there are African American people very senior in, and people of color in many of the vaccine trial leaderships. The NIH and is Dr. Corbett, she's really been out in front, and Tanya Villafana leads AstraZeneca's infectious disease group. So I think this is not a one. Everybody's trying to participate on the medical side, and you guys are a central voice, and you guys can really, really help change the future of medicine and help us all by really evaluating the data, trying to help people who are really seeing a lot of confusion that we've never seen in the media before. This is just unbelievable, as Dr. Romer has pointed out. Get through the bullshit and get us focused on, at the end of the day, we all need a safe and effective vaccine, and we're developing many. So we're going to have lots of choices, as Dr. Romer said, and those choices should help us pick better and better ones. And we should also think that the first vaccine that gets out there might not be ultimately the one that wins. In fact, the pneumococcal vaccine, the first one was developed at Penn, Dr. Austrian's lab, the Austrian Auditorium, and then you had Prevnar, and Prevnar 7 was Prevnar 7. That was replaced by, was it Prevnar 13 or 14, and now you got Prevnar 21. So we keep making. Oh, I had one more thing. I did have one more thing. So by focusing on the groups that also have the highest risk, right? So at risk for diabetes, at risk for heart disease, at risk for certain cancers, at risk for sickle cell, you actually don't have to bring up that issue that news is going to make us torture us about and throw us through the ringer with. But we get to what we want. We want to protect the populations that are most at risk. We want to get them vaccinated, and we don't want to be drawn through the mud with a bunch of nonsense that people bring up to try to divide us. So anyway, that's
Sure. Let me ask.
That's my 30,000 foot view.
Thank you. what would be your recommendation if a vaccine does become available and will become available soon? Is there anything in particular we should be looking for?
So I think the vaccine will have to, it's possible we could hear about vaccines. Pfizer seems to be in the first position and Moderna's close behind. Those are the two in the large scale trials in the US. And then, you have another five, you have a few on partial pause now that we're in phase 3 that will then jump in later, but we'll need all of them to get to that 300 million doses. Otherwise, it'll be much smaller. And I think the first one should be given out at the most at risk people. Number one, healthcare workers and first line responders. And then number two is the groups that are most at risk going down the line of risk, because their risk is two ways. Their risk is that they're going to get sick and then they're going to expose hospital workers and they're going to expose their families and they're going to spread more. So you can even make an argument to groups that I'm not going to go that way, but basically have really their own selfish intent, basically by saying, oh, well, if we vaccinate this group, of course, you won't have to worry as much, right? That kind of bullshit. So that is the way to protect us. Follow the science, get involved with discussion, figure out who's most at risk. Most at risk also includes most at risk because they get infected and they also get disease and they also have higher viral loads and they can spread it more. And that should cut down spread and start to protect all of us. And in fact, in Hong Kong, I believe it was, they shut down the country for a few percent to protect the other 95%. And that had a great effect on lessening the outbreak. So by targeting the at risk or where the outbreak is, you can have an enormous positive effect. And you guys should be helping lead that for us. You guys should be helping getting out that information. You guys should be talking about, well, we're going to have, I think what Dr. Romer said is true. It's hard to get different populations in, but there are across the board large numbers of these populations. So maybe we should start talking about that and how they're doing and things like that to help. I think there are a lot of problems, as was just talked about and the articles have talked about, and but all of us can come together, try to solve them, and not let these other forces drag us in the wrong direction.
Sure. Awesome. Well, there's so much here to discuss, of course. Unfortunately, we're starting to run out of time. Let me ask, is there anything else either of you would think is important for our audience to be aware of or consider?
Well, I think what Dr. Weiner pointed out, which is important and it gets neglected in the US news media, is that the tests are being done internationally. And so whatever we can learn from, for example, what's going on in Latin America or in Africa that might pertain to Americans should be something that we're paying attention to, because these are large trials with large groups of people who might be able to tell us something about what we might experience here in the US. The other issue too, I think was really tricky, is which vaccine. There are going to be multiple ones, and how will we know really which one is right for individuals? And that, I think, is a real challenge. And I think Dr. Weiner is right. You guys need to be on the lookout and help us get the word out. If you think a vaccine is going to be helpful for either Black or Hispanic Americans, then we need to get that information out. And if you think they're not, that's also something that should be said. But to the extent that a vaccine can be helpful, I think it would be great. You guys have a voice and you can use it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Sounds good. Well, what an interesting discussion. I know I got a lot of my questions answered, so thank you both again so much. Dr. Weiner, based on your explanation, I now have a much better understanding of the overall vaccine development process. And Dr. Romer, thank you for grounding us in the social perspective and showing us how a lot of this can be applicable. I'm sure this conversation will only continue to develop over the coming months, so I look forward to following both of your contributions as well. And lastly, thank you all for being such a great audience and for your insightful questions. I really hope you learned something. Please be on the lookout as well for a follow-up survey coming via email shortly to give us some feedback on today's event. Thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Camille.
Bye-bye. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks.